When it came time to getting the work done, to making sure that those bills didn't die, I helped build the coalitions to deliver the key votes necessary to make sure that we were making it clear that we had a commitment to address gun violence in our communities. And when we were looking at making bold investments in early childhood education, and we were clear about the need for a partnership and making sure that every single provider, every single women-owned business, every single individual who has been part of this growing network was at the table, I helped lead the way in creating the early childhood and care department and made sure that despite the resistance that existed and the tension that people were able to come together and get that done. And we followed it up by making bold investments and creating new revenue streams for early childhood education. I am so proud of that work. And I'm proud of the fact that, we've all talked about climate change in this race. But in 2019 legislative session, I was a leader in the coalition to make sure that we were passing the Energy Transition Act and making sure that that made its way across the finish line, that we were clear about our commitment to not just make bold investments into renewable energy and set a high standard for the types of energy that we needed and our renewable energy future, but making sure that we were doing so in a way that promoted a just transition. And I think that that is critical. And so on all of these issues facing our community, when it's come to making sure that we're looking at communities like the one that I live in and the one that Andrew lives in the International District, making it clear that we can no longer be forgotten, that we can no longer overlook the needs of our communities, that's clear, that needs to be priority. When it comes to addressing environmental injustices that exist in communities like Pajarito Mesa, like Tehajali, making sure that we are addressing the Kirtland jet fuel spill that's happened right here in Albuquerque, we are clear that that needs to happen and someone that needs to understand that done. And we need to remember that there are rural communities right here in our district that have for too long been overlooked and ignored. Communities that are still waiting for broadband, still waiting for paved roads, still lacking access to key services, water, wastewater, whatever it is. Communities like Meadow Lake that don't have paved roads here in Valencia County. Communities in the East Mountains that deal with issues when it snows, deal with issues that that so many of our leaders don't think about. And we have a responsibility to make sure that those communities are front and center in the conversation when we are talking about what the next stage, how we invest. And when we talk about a Green New Deal, we need to make sure those communities are front and center. When we talk about expanding broadband access, we have to make sure that those communities are front and center. And all of these changes are possible. Just like what's happened throughout the years, again, oftentimes we're told that we have to wait for the changes that are make a difference in our lives, whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's a Green New Deal, whether it's addressing and expanding broadband in our communities. But the truth is, the reality is that we cannot afford to wait. But if you believe that we can't afford to wait, then we need to elect a change maker to Congress, someone who has proven that they understand how to deliver results for our families and those who need it the most. Someone who has proven time and time again that when the going gets tough, that's when we need to double down and we need to push our vision, our beliefs, our families, our communities to the finish line. And that's what I've been doing my whole career. I'm so honored to have been able to be in this race and to stand with so many of you and to hear directly about the issues that are important. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about them during this town hall. I just am very grateful that you've taken the time out here. And I'll now turn it over back to Beth, I think, for you for questions. Are you the moderator?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
So we are going to either have folks unmute or if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you as well, but it's a smaller group here. And we want to make sure that you get to ask your questions to Victor directly. So if you have a question, you can unmute and go ahead, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you. But I think, it was awesome to hear Victor address all of the things that he just talked about. Joan seems to have a question. So Joan, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Certainly. Hey, Victor. So
hey,
what are your ideas on policy changes for supporting minority-owned businesses and doing state and federal work, and really uplifting marginalized communities who have saw the the American dream by opening their own businesses, and there are barriers in the way for them doing business with the federal government. What do you see as a solution there?
You know, Joan, and I appreciate you being on here, because you taught me a lot about the need for making sure that minority-owned businesses owned by people of color, that they are not forgotten as part of this conversation, especially as we look to rebuild from the pandemic and move forward. And so when we talk about reimagining the infrastructure and promoting a new economy and protecting the vulnerable, we need to make sure that we are looking at what we do to support small businesses and community development by doing things like looking at incentivizing loans to economically disadvantaged communities, working with the Small Business Association and others to provide pathways to ensure that every single community has access to capital. You know, you've talked a little bit about the bonding issue that exists, where our businesses can't get the critical bonding that they need to even start their businesses, and that is no more true in no place more than when we're talking about our small businesses. And figuring out what the right approach is, making sure that we have the ability to both instill the early capital, make sure that the bonding is possible, which is critical to anything from insurance coverage and otherwise, needs to be a priority. You know, I support creating a equity fund similar to the equity funds that we've looked at the state level for everything from outdoor recreation and tourism, but making sure that we're creating an equity fund at the state level that can help ensure that minority, people of color businesses have the necessary capital. And you know, Joan, that the other thing that we really need to make sure that we're doing and that we're looking at is that we're also supporting individuals from the onset at every stage of the conversation. We can't talk about supporting people of color entrepreneurs if we're not also talking about addressing the growing student loan debt crisis that is building within our country. You know, I have so many friends, incredible, brilliant business minds who understand what it takes to run a successful business, have the plans put together, but they can't access capital because they're still dealing with crippling student loan debts. You know, at the state level, I helped make sure that the Opportunity Scholarship, which for those of you who don't know, is the state promise and the state plan to provide free public college tuition for every single New Mexico resident, that it didn't die on the vine. You know, I'm sure you will all be as disappointed in hearing this as I was. In the 2019 legislative session, the State House of Representatives did not put a single dollar in the budget for the Opportunity Scholarship. And we were told, wait for next session. Your idea isn't cooked. You should wait for, you know, an interim committee or have a task force or have a hearing. And, you know, when you're dealing with people who have very serious real debt and are incurring that debt regularly and are not going into universities, not going into our colleges because they know that that is something that is unfeasible to them, the idea of waiting did not sit well with me, did not sit well with our team. And so it was my job to go to the Senate and navigate a process where traditionally, once the budget comes out of the House of Representatives, it's done. You can maybe make a tweak of $100,000 here, $200,000 there, maybe $1 million if there's something that has a lot of Senate support. But to put something that is such a large package, a large policy item forward, it's very difficult and almost unprecedented. But I brought stakeholders to the table, I brought coalitions forward to make sure that we got the Opportunity Scholarship embedded in part into the state budget. And because of that, for the last year, we've created a program where two-year colleges and career technical programs can receive funding to ensure that a student after receiving the lottery scholarship and can receive the Opportunity Scholarship and then still take the opportunity of federal Pell Grants and other types of financial assistance. So the idea of higher education is not out of reach. We need to completely eliminate student loan debt off their books because it does hold entrepreneurs and business people of color back. And that's something that I'm clear about. We need to work towards making public colleges and universities free. And that's a priority for me. And so I appreciate that question, Joan, and your work to support people of color owned businesses in your community.
Victor, thank you so much. And Jen, thank you so much for that question.
Thank
We've
you.
got Cornelia has her hand raised. Cornelia, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Good to see you, Victor.
Thank you, Neely.
I have a question for you. What will your campaign look like going forward if you win the CD1 nomination? We just have Mark Moores, who's a senator, won the nomination for the Republican side. I've heard that he's a moderate Republican. I don't know if I was looking while I was listening to the other answer, but what would be your strategy in moving forward to run?
I appreciate that question, Neely. And let me first recognize the work that you've done throughout the decades to make sure that we have a strong and resilient Democratic Party through the ups and the downs. Dr. Lang, you have been at the forefront of that work. And you are someone that I greatly admire for the commitment that you have shown. When we talk about stalwarts of our party, when we talk about the foundation of our party, we're talking about people like Neely Lang. So I'm very honored to have you here today, Dr. Lang. Let me first say that, I start off a lot of my speeches thanking my staff, because they are some of the most hardworking, incredible individuals that I know. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank everybody that is one of my organizers, one of my communication staff, one of my team members, for everything that they do to make this campaign run. And I hope what you've seen over the last months is my ability to build together a successful, strong campaign, even when it comes to being in a small period of time. Whether it's our communication strategy, our organizing and direct voter contact strategy, our fundraising strategy, we are been clear that we are a force and that we can and build successful, strong coalitions of support to get this campaign across the finish line. I am probably the candidate in this field that has the most direct experience when it comes to running state, local, been part of presidential campaigns. I was the deputy campaign manager for the governor. When she ran her campaign, we beat Steve Pierce by a large margin. And what that took was an understanding of what it takes to run a successful campaign, how to effectively message against a Republican opponent. And look, I am the best candidate to go against a candidate like Mark Moores, somebody who stood by as his colleague was racist, sent to put racist and derogatory questioning against a Black woman cabinet secretary in a committee, and stood by and said absolutely nothing. This is someone who, when it's come to building, whether it's come to the working families tax credit, come to the issues of renewable energy, come to the issues that matter the most to our families, someone who has always been on the wrong side. And so while we can all pretend to be things that we're not, if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, chances are a duck. And this guy is someone who I have no question in my mind, based on the knowledge that I have of working with him and going directly up against him to make sure that we are passing the most monumental piece of legislation of the last years. I know that he would be a proud member of the Freedom Caucus, a proud member of the Tea Party. And I will remind him of that at every step of the way, that is where his record stands. And we saw historic turnout in 2020 of young people. We saw historic turnout when it comes to people of color. If we've learned anything in the last elections, whether we're talking about Georgia, we're talking about New Mexico, talking about any place where Arizona, where we saw a difference, where we saw the ability to make change, then we saw that people of color and young people were the reason that we were able to get these candidates across the finish line. And as someone who would be the youngest member of Congress, someone who reflects a different generation, someone who reflects a different community than many members in this race, I think that voice and that perspective will give people a reason to come out and vote. And so I know I can build the strongest campaign. We've already begun doing it. We're ready to go. I hope you've seen that throughout the last months. And I'm ready to win this thing, Neely. So let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you, Victor. And thank you for that question. Amber, you had your hand raised. Do you have a question for Victor?
Hi there. Thank you. Hi, Victor. My name is Amber Carrillo, and I live in Albuquerque. How are you today?
I'm good, Amber. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. I'm really excited by your campaign, and I, wish you the very best. So I'm a lot concerned about the special session that's going to happen on the 30th with regard to it being primarily focused on recreational cannabis. And it's not so much that I'm concerned about that, particular crop, but it is more the surrounding folks who are involved and kind of at the table, who tend to be folks that are already well funded. And another issue is that some of the people who are at the table have actually been very responsible for having youth incarcerated due to having offenses with marijuana, very low amounts of marijuana on them. And so for me, that's a real problem, that kind of body is going to be profiting. The other problem is that we understand that a lot of land is being purchased near waterways, and also we'll be using tribal roads to transport productive materials. And that's a huge concern right now because the tribes have not been consulted whatsoever. And so, so for me, it's always this question about why are the tribes never consulted on anything, and how will you change that?
Amber, I'm really glad that you've asked me that question, because I'm a big supporter of the legalization of recreational cannabis for adult use. But every single time, if you go back to any single forum or any single debate or any single time that I've talked about this issue, I've spoken about what the conditions are for making sure that that's a reality. And for me, I've always said a couple things. One, our tribes and pueblos need to be at the decision-making table when it comes to this critical issue, whether it's at the federal level or the state issue. Anything short of that is a failure at direct government-to-government relationship that I squarely believe in. It is an affront to tribal sovereignty, something that is a principle that I hold very dear to my heart, and one that I think that needs to be thoroughly examined when we're talking about recreational cannabis for adult use. Again, something that I support. I also think that, any package that talks about recreational cannabis absolutely needs to make sure that we are including key social justice provisions that include the expungement of cannabis crimes, and making sure that there are key advocates for those types of reforms that are included as part of the conversations and are there. Again, whether we're talking about a special session in a few days or we're talking about a federal bill that's going to be before me in 4 months, I'm always going to push for those voices. And I've also been very clear about the need for worker protections. You will not be surprised that there are many wealthy individuals who have taken stock in this market and who would like nothing more than to see a system in which they are able to overlook union rights, overlook workers' rights, create a system where workers would be put in subpar conditions and not have their rights protected. And I refuse to let that be a reality when we're having a key critical conversation, like when we are talking about the legalization of recreational cannabis. We need to make that a priority, that happens at the table. And we also have to make sure that we are being very clear when it comes to how licenses are equitably distributed, right? Because those licenses don't belong in just the hands of a few wealthy individuals. We need to make sure that they are accessible to individuals in our community. People of color can get access to them, that is an equitable way. There's an equitable way of distributing them. And so I think that is very critical part of the conversation. And land and water use, we have to be clear about that. We have the environment where we can be leaders in recreational cannabis. We have the space, we have the technology, we have the wisdom and understanding that comes from generations of agricultural innovations that we've been putting forward. But we need to make sure that any plan that we put forward, that we are looking at how we're going to do that. And whether that's the State Department of Agriculture or the Federal Department of Agriculture, it's critical for me that we are looking at that and taking that into account as we're looking at those policy legislation. And so I join you, Amber, in the chorus of people who are pushing for those voices to be included in this table now. I will always fight for those voices to be included. And in Congress, I will make sure that I advocate for them. If I have to take the leaders of the sovereign nations with me directly to the Department of Agriculture and make sure that they have a seat at the table, I will do that. If I have to make sure that I educate other members about what tribal to tribal, government to government consultation means, I will absolutely do that. If I have to make sure that I am standing up against a bill and trying to amend a bill that does not directly include our tribes and pueblos and does not provide them with that direct government to government agreement, I will do that too. And so thank you for your question, because it is, recreational cannabis is a game changer for New Mexico. We should be a leader, but we need to do it right.
Victor, thank you so much for that answer. And Amber, thank you for your question. Remember, folks, to raise your hand to ask a question. I think Markella's got a question now for Victor. Markella, you can go ahead and unmute.
Oh,
hey,
yeah.
Markella.
So my question is, I have two questions. So how do you plan to reverse the environmental damage New Mexico has experienced from fracking? And two, do you have a plan to bring specific renewable energy options / companies to New Mexico?
I appreciate that question. And look, I was very proud to join the New Mexico Climate Alliance and making it very clear that we needed to pause fracking and support the president in his efforts to pause fracking that are happening. I stand with Secretary Holland and I stand with President Biden in that effort. But we need to go further than that. We need to make sure that we are passing the Green New Deal so that we can, and what that means, it's a big word and it's a big package. But here's why it's so important to New Mexico. It's important because there are communities in our state and in our country, but right here in New Mexico, we see it directly. That one, never had access to water, wastewater. Two, don't have paved streetlights. We talked a little bit earlier about Meadow Lake. Communities that don't have streetlights, don't have paved roads, don't have the infrastructure that they need. But then on top of that, we also deal with the undue burden that our generations have been suffering from environmental injustices like unreclaimed uranium mines, oil and gas industry that has just abandoned pits, and we need to be very clear about the need to reclaim that. And so for me, a Green New Deal is a way of doing that and making sure that we are creating jobs, creating economic opportunities, and bringing some of this important infrastructure to our communities. Water, wastewater services, making sure that we are doing something about the Kirtland jet fuel spill here in Albuquerque, making sure that we're getting communities like Tehajale and Pajarito Mesa water, but also making sure that every single community on the Navajo Nation and our sovereign nations has access to water, but also dealing with the fact that we have to reclaim these mines. We have to make sure that the toxic legacy does not continue to jeopardize our water stream, because it's a real issue. There are individuals in our communities across our state who travel miles to get water, and the water that they get is contaminated because of uranium mining. I've spoken about this before, but I'll never forget the conversation that I had with a woman who was in tears at a community meeting in Acoma that I was invited to by the governor to attend. And she was telling me about the fact that her father, died of exposure from uranium mining in her community, and that 2 years later, her mother died because it was her mother who washed her father's clothing when he got home. This isn't a unique story. It's a story that happens all the time. And it is a clear indication that we need to be clear about the transition to clean renewable energy and do it aggressively. And so the other part of the Green New Deal that we need to look at is the investment when it comes to critical renewable energy infrastructure that we need to invest in our communities. Transmission line infrastructure, battery power infrastructure, making sure that communities like Torrance County can be wind leaders in the way that they're showing that they can and should be. I like to say this all the time because when I first heard it, I didn't believe it. All of the grids in the country come together in Clovis, New Mexico. We have the best wind in the country. We have the best solar in the country. And yet we don't produce at the levels and the capacity that we can. And part of that problem is our grid and our transmission line infrastructure. And so I worked in the Energy Transition Act to set the standards at which we need to be producing renewable energy. But I also worked to make sure that we had the Renewable Energy Transmission Authority funded in a way that we could start mapping out what transmission lines in our state would mean. But we need federal investments to make that a reality and make sure that we have someone who understands that, and from a New Mexico perspective in Congress. I know that I can be that person. I was talking to some of the biggest renewable energy producers, wind producers, solar producers, on a call just the other day, where we talked about the need for federal intervention when it comes to making sure that this transmission lines can be brought out. The regulatory burdens and hurdles that exist for these types of industries. What's clear to me is what's clear to them. I know that I can get the job done and make sure that we are aggressively deploying these types of investments in our community, while we're also deploying things like broadband connectivity for every single community in our state.
Victor, thank you so much. Crane's got his hand raised. I think he's got a question from an SCC member that was passed along to him. Crane, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yeah. So this question comes from Christina Wright, who I believe is here right now. And she asked me this a couple of days ago when I was talking to her. She said, Victor, how would you get rid of dark money? What would you do to reform it? And I think just generally in talking to SCC members, people are really concerned about campaign finance reform. So what is your plan to reform it?
I appreciate that. Christina, if she's on, thank you for bringing it up. I appreciate it. Addressing campaign finance reform and democratic issues is the foundation upon which we talk about every other issue, right? You can't have environmental justice, you can't have reproductive justice, you can't have economic justice if you don't have a ability to elect the people who matters. What we're seeing in Georgia happen is the very essence of what the fight is about. There are individuals in Congress right now who would like nothing more than to silence the voices of people of color across our country. And we need to be very clear about our responsibility to stop that. And so we need to pass the For the People Act, make sure that we're clear about that. And when I was the legislative, I'll back up a sec. When I was the legislative and political director for Conservation Voters New Mexico, I was very engaged in issues of dark money disclosure, of making sure that we are covering campaign finance reform, making sure that we are advocating things like automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration. And people asked, why are you so involved in those issues? And I remember, when I first met Secretary of State Luce Oliver, who I did a town hall with on this very same issue, she was a little confused too, because she had never seen that side of the organization advocating in that way. And for me, it was very clear that who we elect matters when it comes to our air, land, and water, and we need to be clear about that responsibility. And so I'm going to stand strong for the For the People Act, make sure that we are closing dark money loopholes and disclosure requirements that exist between that, reversing Citizens United, being clear about our responsibility there, making sure that we are increasing the transparency requirements that exist when it comes to dark money organizations and special interests in our elections, making sure that we are being clear about our responsibility to have equitable polling locations that are accessible to be clear about this, to be clear about the fact that no individual should lack access to a polling spot location because of distance, travel requirements, etc. That needs to be a requirement. And then also the For the People Act, something that Secretary of State Luce Oliver told me in our discussion was that she needs the funding that's embedded within that legislation to make sure that we have the election security and innovation efforts that we are looking to invest in. We also have to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to make sure that the infringements on the Voting Rights Act that were gutted in Shelby County versus Holder are reversed. And there's so much work that we need to do. And we had a question yesterday on a forum and with organized labor about the filibuster. And I completely support eliminating the filibuster because we need to get the For the People Act across. If we do not, the fate of voting rights will be forever in question in our country. And so it's a critical reality. So I appreciate that question. And Andrew, you asked, how can you share how you're leading an example with your campaign when it comes to dark money? I haven't taken any dark money. I committed at the beginning of this campaign that I wasn't going to take a dime of corporate PAC money and that I wasn't going to take a dime from the oil and gas industry. And I've been true to that word. And I'm very grateful for the broad coalitions of people who have come and stood behind us in this campaign in our opportunity to make history and elect the first LGBTQ member, the youngest member of Congress, someone who understands the needs of this community. But I will never take money from those individuals.
Victor, thank you so much. Anna, you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I saw Kate Cook. I don't want to butt in line. I saw your hand up. You're okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Nice to see you all. This is Anna. I wanted to ask a question about, this is just, I feel like a reckoning in our country at the moment. We are really seeing the both insufficiencies in our healthcare system, but also just in the way that our government shows up for our people. And by that, I mean, you know, really Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer folks, a rising majority. And I think it's a reckoning in the sense of what we've watched play out this summer, but before then with the protests to the streets, whether that be Breonna Taylor or others. And it's an opportunity to radically reimagine public safety, community care, and how we spend money as society. There are two pieces of legislation currently moving through Congress right now that I believe begin to, of course, they don't finish addressing, you know, systemic racism, inequality. But one of them is the Breathe Act, that's divesting from our incarceral state. And then the other is the Thrive Act, which is about investing in millions of good paying jobs in care work and renewable energy. So I would like to hear what your stance is on those, and, you know, how would you not only maybe co-sponsor those bills, but be a champion?
I appreciate that question, Anna, and you're exactly right. And one of the reasons why our communities keep getting overlooked is because we keep electing, and we let corporations and special interests push us towards electing millionaires and billionaires into Congress, and people who are tied and close to special interests. And, you know, this is, you know, it was important for me to run in this election, because I understand that we can't keep expecting to elect traditional candidates and hoping for different results and hoping for different outcomes. And it's very clear when you're talking about the two pieces of legislation. I think I'm the only candidate in this field that's talked, I'll start at the last one, as talked about the Thrive Act in this election. And the reason that the Thrive Act is important to me is because I've worked in spaces where environmental injustices where I've seen directly what that looks like. I've been in colonias where people don't have water, don't have wastewater, don't have paved roads, don't have street lighting. So the federal government doesn't even believe that they exist. I've waded in sewage up to my mid-calf, and I've seen directly what it is that people struggle with and why they've lost faith in their government and their system and their representatives. And I understand what environmental injustices are. And so when I uplift the stories and the voices of those people, I want you to know that that is the cornerstone of my life's work, is advocating from an environmental justice perspective and elevating those voices. That is who I fight for when I talk about building a renewable energy economy, when I talk about addressing environmental injustice. And those are the voices, you know, I'm very proud that we were able to defeat 100% of environmental legislation in the 2015 legislative session when I was the legislative and political director for conservation voters in New Mexico. But you know what? I'm even more proud of the fact that I was one of the few leaders in an environmental organization that was a person of color, and that was very clear about the need to elevate the voices of people of color into that conversation, because they were being left out and they were being ignored and forgotten. And so I'd be a proud sponsor of the Thrive Act, making sure that we're going through that. And, you know, and the Breathe Act, absolutely. You know, we have a potential to save $80 billion in our country if we divest from private prisons. We could put that back into addressing, you know, you talked about healthcare. We could put that back into addressing Medicare for all, into building more resiliency during the pandemic, into getting people the critical needs, things that they need that we're being asked for. But we have to be willing to divest and reinvest directly into communities of color. And that will be a priority for me, making sure that while we make these de-investments, we are again making sure that this money and these resources come back to communities of color. And I've proven, Anna, to your last part of your question, how can I be more than a co-sponsor? I've proven that I'm the candidate in this race that can build coalitions, that knows the process, that understands the reality of what it takes to get legislation across the finish line, how to navigate oftentimes difficult and opaque processes to deliver results for our communities at a time that they are demanding action. And so I will work in coalition and with build those coalitions, make sure that we are building support, making sure that we are at every opportunity holding people accountable that stand in our way. And I look forward to working with you to get that done, Anna. So I appreciate you being there here.
Anna, thank you so much for that question. And Victor, it's always great to hear you talk about things like that matter so much to you. Kat's got her hand raised. Kat, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, so Victor, I know that you have talked a lot about your work on reproductive rights and fighting for women's reproductive freedoms, but I'm also curious what you plan to do when you get to Congress regarding issues of domestic violence and sexual assault.
Yeah, you know, this one is a really personal one to me because I came from a family where my mom was a victim of domestic violence. And in so many instances, I got to see that. And my mom had to figure out how to navigate that world. And she was lucky that she had a support system around her that she could lean on to help her in those situations, but not everybody does. And that's why reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act and being clear about making a long-term foundational piece of legislation that does not require reauthorization is so clear. We need to make sure that we are reauthorizing the legislation and ensuring that it is the strongest bill that it can be when it comes to the funding that exists for rapid rehousing, transportation, family needs that people have, because not everyone is as lucky as my family was. And so we need to make sure that is a priority. The other part that we need to make sure stays within that legislation is parts of the legislation that close loopholes when it comes to the stalker loophole and the boyfriend loophole that will prohibit individuals who should not have access to the firearm, those who are convicted of misdemeanor stalking charges, for instance, from gaining access to a firearm, because we know that the presence of a firearm makes it 8 times more likely that a tragedy will ensue in a domestic violence situation. And so being clear about my commitment to addressing gun violence prevention, it needs to be part of that conversation. You know, the Violence Against Women Act is a critical effort. We need to make sure that we are funneling as much federal resources to the organizations that uplift women, family members, everybody. And also we need to make sure that the LGBTQ community is a very real part of that conversation, because we see the trans women, women of color, trans women of color are so disproportionately impacted by this type of violence. And that is a perspective that I will guarantee you I will bring to Congress. So thanks for that question, Kat.
All right, I think Crane's got another question. Crane, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
Sure. So Spike said something in the chat a little while ago that he was muting himself and taking off his video because his broadband connection up in the East Mountains was not great, and I wanted to make sure he could hear everything. What do you plan to do to expand rural broadband access, in New Mexico and across the country?
I appreciate that question. I was the lead in the governor's office. I was tasked with, my task during the pandemic was being lead when it came to our state's response, specifically in our sovereign nations and our rural communities. And what I saw was something that I knew, but it was a chilling reminder of just how grave it is. Access to broadband is a public health issue, is a public safety issue, and it is an issue that needs to be put at the top of our priority sheet. At the state level, I worked to make sure that we were securing the type of resources we needed to begin the conversation when it came to what broadband access looks like, and breaking down. During the pandemic, I was really in charge of breaking down regulatory barriers, whether it was dealing with the DOT right-of-way, an issue that existed at the PRC, an issue otherwise that was standing in the way of expanding and aggressively getting that broadband out to our communities. And as a member of Congress, my job is going to make sure that we have every single federal dollar that we can towards getting connectivity for every single family. And that includes both building out the infrastructure that needs to exist and thinking of creative ways to get that infrastructure out there. There's so many different strategies for broadband. Laying fiber is a critical effort, but one of the things that I worked with the Economic Development Department when I was at the state is, there's so many creative solutions. Hot air balloons, for instance, is one opportunity for broadband in places where it's hard to get out to. You know, different types of fiber that don't require the same types of dig policies that that the traditional broadband infrastructure does. And so we've got to be creative. We've got to make sure that that perspective is at the forefront. We've got to make sure we get every dollar, but that funding also needs to make sure that we are looking at providing the types of resources necessary for families who often can't afford broadband coverage. Or even if they have it in their communities. And so that part of expanding broadband is also critical, and it's a critical step to getting that done. You know, I'm as tired as I'm sure all of you are of hearing stories and seeing pictures of children who are outside of fast food restaurants because they need to use the internet. People who are crowded outside of libraries when they're closed because they need to use the internet to get their homework done. We've got to get this done. It needs to be at the forefront of every single education bill, every single economic development bill, every single bill when it comes to building out a green energy economy. Every single piece of legislation that deals with infrastructure, deals with economic development, should have a component when it comes to broadband. And I'll fight to make sure that that's included in when I'm in Congress.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Crane, for addressing that. Andrew, you've got your hand raised. You want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions, but I can ask one right now and wait my turn the next time around. So a major concern for any progressive running for any office is that we're often the target for why Democrats end up losing things, like some of the House or Senate seats that flipped in like the last election. It was because they were running progressive ideas. So my question for you, Victor, is how are you going to combat that narrative?
You know, I'm really good, Andrew. We've talked about this before, about meeting people where they are and talking to them about what it means. You know, I had a conversation the other day about with an individual who was asking me, what does it look like? You know, Medicare for all is an issue that you know, I worry about talking about because it's not going to be about, it's not a popular issue when it comes to moderates. And I said, okay, so let's talk about what that means. So, you know, let's talk about automatically enrolling anybody who loses their job into Medicare. Let's talk about making sure that we are expanding traditional Medicare to lower the eligibility age to 50 and cover all children up to age 20. Like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about negotiating when the negotiating power of Medicare when it comes to lowering prescription drugs. Let's talk about what it means to making sure that we are using Medicare as a vehicle to address the maternal morbidity crisis in our state. And we've got to break it down for people to understand. Be clear, we support Medicare for all. And this is what it includes. This is what it means. And when you get people to understand that, when you effectively convey a message to make sure that that happens, we have a unique opportunity because people are with us. When people know what we're talking about, people understand. But we can't let people get away with villainizing our message. And I've been a very effective messenger at the state legislative level of conveying and talking to diverse stakeholders to get that type of understanding for them on key legislative items. And I know that I can convey, whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's a Green New Deal, get them to understand why and what is included in those proposals and build a strong campaign out there. And the other thing that needs to happen, Andrew, that, you know, what happens a lot of times with progressives is that we go and we don't deliver. You know, we say we are going to do one thing and then it comes out being that we do something else. And so having someone that is, one, clear about their values, two, clear about how they're going to get it done and how to deliver in difficult systems, I think is very critical. And so that's something that I think will be an important asset for us with me as a member of Congress. Is, one, I can effectively convey a message in a way that people understand it, where it resonates with people. But two, that, you know, I know that I can deliver on these issues and make sure that people know how it's making a very real difference in their lives.
Victor, thank you so much. And Andrew, no one else has got their hand raised. So if you want to go ahead and ask that next question, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, sure. So Victor, you mentioned that we live in the same ward. And as you know, that's the international district and it's largely disenfranchised. So my question regarding that is, how would people here know that you're working for them?
You know, I've been working for this community for my, you know, entire adult life, in whatever way that I've been able to do it. You know, Andrew, it's interesting, you know, I don't work in state government anymore, but in a very real way, I still help people with the needs that they have. You know, my cell phone number is so widely distributed to all the people that I've worked for, because I wanted them to know that I would answer them even if it was midnight on a Saturday. I wanted them to know that I was going to be there for them to pick up the call. And I dealt with so many issues. You know, I've gotten calls from people who are scared because they got their text about their vaccine, and then they weren't able to get in. And so I've gotten calls of tears over the last months, people that are so worried about this pandemic, want to be able to live their lives again. And I've helped them navigate that system. I was dealing with someone the other day whose family, who are, you know, a single mother of 3, has 1 grandchild. And she got a weird letter from unemployment, and she, you know, put it out there. Who can help me? And someone gave her my number, and she called me, and I was on the phone for an hour trying to figure out who at unemployment I could get to talk to her, to navigate that process and to figure out what was going on. I did my own independent research, and that's just who I am, right? If it means going to someone for their MBD appointment because they can't get a license, or they can't seem to figure out why they're getting denied, I'll go with them. When it comes to making sure that, you know, we are doing whatever we can for communities, you know, that is my brand of leadership that I am very proud of. That I will do whatever I can, no matter where I am. You know, those things aren't going to help my campaign, but they're going to help me know that I'm making a difference in my community, and that one person's life was a little bit easier. And that they maybe had a little bit more of their resources. You know, I was talking to another individual recently named Lovey McGee, who is a member of this party and somebody who is a full-time volunteer at public schools, and reminded me a lot of my mom when she was talking to me. She gives at schools in our community. She helps provide snacks, meals, resources, after-school tutoring and counseling for students when they get out of school. And I called her and I was like, "What do you need, Lovey? How can I help you?" And she was like, "I don't, you know, right now that school's not in session, I get calls every once in a while of individuals who they don't have anywhere to go, and I don't have anyone giving me any resources during this time." And so I called some friends. I put resources together to get them whatever items that they needed to do that. I did that, a similar thing with the church in our community, the Church of the Nazarene, to make sure that they had the resources they needed for a distribution that they made. That type of work is something that I'm always going to be committed to doing. We all have to do our part, and I've always been committed to doing my part.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Andrew, for that question. No one else has their hand raised, and we're coming up on the hour here. I want to make sure that anyone else who wants to gets the chance to ask a question. So if folks don't know how to raise their hand, you can go ahead and unmute. And I really want to make sure anybody is able to ask any questions that they have. Does anybody else have a question for Victor?
Yes, I have a question.
Go for it, Chris.
My name is Chris Dio, retired Navy, 26 years. Many veterans, and I belong to like 8 different veteran organizations in the city of Albuquerque, including the Military and Veterans Affairs Advisory Board to the Mayor, Tim Keller. And most veterans are concerned about the VA, them trying to privatize the VA. And the majority of veterans, if not most, if not all, are against privatizing the VA, and want to know what your stance and what would you do to keep the VA from being privatized. And the only issue that I have with this VA has been very good. In fact, I just got my first vaccine. I'm under 60 years old, so they're doing great on the vaccine part. The only issue I do have with our VA right now is our parking. That's before the pandemic was here. If you went there before the pandemic at 9 a.m., you could be driving for 20, 30 minutes trying to find a parking. So that's the only issue I have with our VA. But for the purpose, most veterans do not want it privatized. What is your stance for the VA?
I'm completely against privatization, Chris. And at first, let me thank you for your service, for the work that you do in our communities and that every single veteran has done. I'm very honored that you've joined us and that you brought the perspective. Because let me tell you, Chris, I'm very disappointed that of all the major forums and debates that I've been part of, no one has asked about veterans. And I've been looking for an opportunity to talk about them. And, we've been very clear about the need to increase our funding and our support for the VA. And I'm in strong opposition to privatization of the VA, but I'm going to push for more funding necessary to make sure that we're fulfilling the spectrum of healthcare that I believe is necessary to meet our commitments to veterans and their families and their spouses, their children, whoever it is. And I think that it's incomprehensible and unacceptable to me that our VA services are not fully funded. I want to be tireless in my commitment to making sure that funding comes through, that we're addressing that deficit when it comes especially to behavioral health and mental health care providers at the VA. And that includes, for me, making sure that we're expanding telehealth services, remote at-home visits by providers, and streamlining whatever appointment process is necessary because so many veterans feel that the process is too hard for them and difficult for them to navigate. And we've got to make sure that we're also effectively communicating to our veterans and military families the broad range of services that are available and making it as easy as possible to do that. I worked with Secretary Grego to help different individuals in the veterans community navigate their healthcare, navigate the different services, worked with veteran service officers in that process. But we need to be doing more. And I'm committed to you that my office, one of my main priorities is going to be having world-class constituent services. And that means helping navigate whatever issues you're facing with the VA. And so just to recap, privatization is not the way to go. So thank you for asking that question, Chris.
Yeah,
Thank you, Victor.
Real quick, I've had great service there, no complaints. The only thing, like I said, is before the COVID pandemic, the parking issue has been an issue. I've been raising it up for the last 5 or 6 years, and I've been told by Andrew from the VA that they got the funding. It's supposed to happen, but nothing's happened, and it's been going on for 5 or 6 years. But like I said, before the pandemic, the parking, people would be driving there for 20 to 30 minutes trying to find a parking. If you had an appointment at 9, you had to be there by 8 o'clock to get a parking. So that's the only issue I have with our VA. Everything I've done with this VA has been excellent. Number one,
Good.
I've had no issues with this VA at all. Thank
Good.
you.
I'm glad to hear that, Chris. And that's the service that you deserve and that you earned and that you're entitled to. So I'm very glad to hear that. And so let's make sure that that's a reality for every single person that comes and make sure that everybody receives whatever we can do. And if you're receiving world-class care, let's make it world-class care plus, because that's what you deserve. And if that means addressing this parking situation, I'm glad that you brought that to my attention, something I didn't know about, but something I will be talking about more on the campaign trail. So I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you.
All right. So we had, I think, Barbara unmuted. I want to give her the chance, and then we'll go to Dawn, who's got her hand raised. So Barbara, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making time to do this, Victor.
Sure.
I've really been impressed with your social media presence. That's part 2 of my question, but part 1 of my question is, my neighbors and I are wondering if you have ever held an elected office.
So that question, the first part of your question is I've been elected member of the State Central Committee like all of you, if that counts. But I've never held elected office. I've held appointed office. I was the chair of the New Mexico Community Development Council, where I oversaw the investment of tens of millions of dollars in federal funding for infrastructure and economic development projects across the state, and was very proud. On top of those investments that we made, I also led the way of investing $13.3 million to housing and housing assistance and rental assistance during the pandemic. We worked with the Mortgage Finance Authority to create the first statewide program to address the housing crisis that was happening in the midst of the global pandemic. And so I served in that appointed office. And, as the governor's legislative director, even though I've never held elected office, I've probably been at the forefront of some of the major legislative accomplishments, whether it's the Energy Transition Act, gun violence prevention measures that we've passed, key investments in early childhood education, making sure that we are working to create economic development opportunities, like doubling the amount of investment from the Small Business Investment Council, and actually getting those across the finish line. And so I venture to say that I probably have the most legislative experience when it comes to leading on those large scale issues in this race. And I think that's a critical perspective to bring to Congress, and one that I think makes me unique.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And then Dawn, you
I think
got
Barbara
your
had
hand raised.
a part two, which I don't want to.
Barbara, did you have a second question?
Yes, some of in my community, we have a lot of elder citizens who've had a lot of difficulty navigating the registration for vaccination process, in terms of getting texts, in terms of getting emails, in terms of getting online to register. How would you problem solve that? What would you do going forward if you were the decision and policymaker now?
If I was the decision and policymaker at the state level that was doing the programming, or if I was in Congress, Barbara?
Well, I would understand that a state level administrator would work with their congressional delegates to ask questions about the rollout of vaccines. Yeah. So whichever position you want to argue from, or
sure. So here's what I'll say. You know, as a member of Congress, my job is to advocate for community members and in real time help them navigate and problem solve those issues. And so I'm going to be very clear about the need for our office to directly help, just the same way that I do it today, in making sure that we are helping people navigate what can oftentimes be a difficult process. You know, none of us are used to having to go online to register for a vaccine. We just make an appointment with our doctor's office, or we do something different. And so whatever my office has to do to help people in real time, that's going to be a priority. And then of course, I'm going to be an advocate for making sure that that whatever feedback my office is getting as a hub for community, for constituent services, that makes its way back to whatever state partners need to hear that, and that we are working to improve that resource. And so the other thing that we can do is we can do open phone hours where we have additional volunteers and community members in addition to my office staff that are accessible and available if anybody wants to call and ask a question, because oftentimes phone lines get jammed up at the state level. And so creating more venues of people who are educated on the process that can help people navigate in real time, I think that is a priority for me. And so figuring out creative ways to problem solve those issues, I think, needs to happen. And, you know, also the other thing that I'm going to do is something I'm very good at, and I'm going to make sure that the state is getting whatever resources they need to build whatever technology and infrastructure systems and hire whatever staff they need to really help people get through that process, and making sure that no community member feels like they can't get access to that programming. And so in all those ways, you know, and then I want to hear from people like you, Barbara. If you have ideas, I want to make sure that my staff and that me are accessible for those opportunities to learn from you and for community members about what else we can be doing to improve the vaccination process. And I will be your advocate in getting those done. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. All right. Dawn's got her hand raised. I want to make sure we get to her. She's had it raised for a while. So Dawn, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Dawn.
Hi. Thanks so much for hosting this. I have a couple of questions like the last couple of people, so just keep that in mind. My first question is about just the addiction crisis that really plagues our state and our entire country. And I would love to get your perspective on how you would like to change it from being, you know, a criminalized act to something that requires empathy and nurturing and rehab, and also to touch upon, you know, there's private not-for-profit, private for-profit rehabs that are across the country that are really predatory and don't have adequate regulations. I don't even know if there's any sort of regulation with rehab, but just a lot of rehabs that cost a ton of money and give no results and completely drain families of any savings that they might have had, put them in incredible debt, and then they're still left with the problem. So yeah, I would just love to get your take on anything regarding addiction.
Sure. You know, addiction is something that's really personal to me, Donna. And I don't know if you've heard me talk about this, but my dad was a drug addict, alcoholic. I've seen the way that it impacts families and it tears family apart, and still a very real part of my dad's struggle to this day. I love him to death, and you know, he's well on his journey, but the struggles, you don't ever get rid of those struggles. And you know, it tore my family apart in a very real way, and we dealt with financial insecurity. I dealt with mental trauma that resulted from it, and so I know what that feels like. And so it's something that's super personal to me. You know, I think we do need to move towards more innovative models of addressing drug addiction and behavioral health services in our state and in our country. I was on a town hall that I did with Secretary Kathy Kunkel recently, and one of the things that we were talking about was a initiative that she actually visited Canada to get to see firsthand, and one that I support at the state level. And we were looking at ways before this pandemic of how we bring it to New Mexico when it comes to the issue of safe injection sites, where individuals can get access to whatever, you know, to the needles that they need. They can get their dose of whatever drug it is that they have to get. And then they go through the process where they can also, in that same spot, that same site, they're seeing and talking to a behavioral health care provider. They're talking to specialists. They're talking to people who can deal with their housing insecurity, their food insecurity. You know, and I think that that's the type of model that we really need to be moving for. And we can't just have these blinders on where incarceration is the answer, increasing penalties is the answer. You know, I don't think that strategy's worked. I think it just continues to break apart families of color across our state specifically, and families that deal with these very real traumas on their daily basis and are trying to figure out how they're going to make it to the next day. And so I want to make sure that we are attracting, recruiting, retaining the providers that we need, that we are creating whatever behavioral health care opportunities and supporting local nonprofits and local organizations to help people navigate that here in our communities, but also that we're looking into innovative models like like the safe injection sites that they're doing in, I believe it's Toronto. But that's something that I really want to look to. And so, Dawn, I'd love to have another conversation with you about what other strategies you think we should be looking at, and it's at the federal level, and how we can support the local efforts at getting that done. And as far as private for-profit rehab, it's disgusting. You know, I remember when we were dealing with my dad's situation. It was like a Sunday morning, and my mom was crying, and she was calling, trying to find a treatment facility for my dad. And you know, I said, "Mom, I'll help you. And so I started making calls, and God, I mean, at 13, 14 years old, I saw how hard it was to find a bed. You know, and it's a perfect situation for these types of predatory providers to really take advantage of families who are suffering. And, you know, I've never directly dealt with them in a, you know, but I have dealt with predatory nursing homes and long-term care facilities. And I know that what needs to happen. And I've dealt with them in a way that I've just gone and visited and done walkthroughs and asked the tough questions that we need to be asking. And I will, if I have to go to sites, if I have to go to some of these providers and make sure that those questions are getting asked, I'll be there in a heartbeat. Because I don't think anybody should be subjected to this kind of predatory action. And so I'll also make sure that we're looking at holding congressional panels and investigations into these types of providers, and making sure that we're clear about those about what liabilities exist, and then working to create regulatory requirements of them at the federal level, so that no family has to endure a broken system like that. And so I appreciate that question. Thanks for bringing it to light. I haven't had a chance to talk about it, and something that I really hits close to home. So thanks, Dawn. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And then I do have a second question that's completely unrelated. I just didn't know if anyone else. Okay. So you had mentioned when getting broadband, I believe it was broadband up during COVID, that you had to break down a lot of regulatory barriers to make that happen. Sometimes I feel like our government kind of folds on itself and shoots itself in the foot, making it challenging to get things done. So when we're looking at the Thrive Act, which is just a monster of endeavor, how can you help to break down those barriers on a national level to really get it moving quickly?
That's a good question, Dawn. And you're right. You know, I have zero patience for people who want to stand in the way of getting things done. And I was very impatient and about that when I was working with the state, when it was our own people that were standing in the way of doing things and getting it done. It was like, just get the work done. Let's just do it. And so when it comes to navigating those types of processes, I am the person in this race that I think best understands how to navigate, you know, bureaucracies and administrations to figure out what those silos of communication are and how to break them down. And so when I say that, like, you know, I'm going to participate in panels and oversight and have an oversight role, I'm very clear about what that means. It means exposing where those are and making sure that we are bringing the individuals that are responsible for addressing that, whether it be the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Transportation, to the table to address that. And so I'm very good about figuring out what the roadblocks are and then figuring out who I need to go to make sure that that doesn't stand in the way of the process. And so when we're talking about big monumental policies like the Thrive Act, you know, we got to figure out what are we've got to do this as a coalition, right? We got to make sure that everybody that's an expert is at the table to give us the insight of what are those challenges, where do they exist? And then it's my job to communicate what those challenges are and to expose them for what they are, and then make sure that we are eliminating them either in federal statute or by administrative action.
Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dawn, for those great questions. We are 12 minutes over our time, and looks like we've gotten to almost everyone's questions. So wanted to thank everyone for making some time in the middle of their Saturday during March Madness, no less, to be here to talk to Victor. I'm sure you've talked with so many members of our staff as well. I'm gonna let Victor close us out here because he's always got more to say, and I'm gonna let him close it out. But before he does, I just want to thank everyone for coming. Everyone on this call has been contacted by our organizing team, by Victor himself. We've got a few days left, so get in touch. Make sure that we know, that you're on our side. And Victor, I'm going to let you close us out in our last few minutes here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for everything that you all are doing for our party and for our state. And look, I'm not jealous of the decision that you're going to have to make come Tuesday. It's a difficult one. But I will leave you with this. You know, we've talked about the Thrive Act, we've talked about the Breathe Act, we've talked about legislation that, you know, can't afford to wait, that we need someone who can really afford to get that work done. And I've proven throughout my career that that's what I'm good at. That's what I believe in doing, in delivering results for our communities in a very real way. And, you know, we can continue to elect traditional candidates but let's not expect different results. You know, look at who the change makers are in Congress right now. It's individuals like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, individuals like Katie Porter, who weren't traditional candidates, but believed in making a difference, understood how to get that done, understood the urgency of the moment, and then made it happen, and are making real change in Congress right now. And I know that I can make that difference, you know, and I need you to, I'm asking you today to believe in me, to believe in swinging for the fences, to believe in the promise of the fact that we can expect and demand more from our elected leaders. And so I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. And of course, I'm always accessible for any follow-up questions that you might have. So just let one of our organizers know if you're trying to get a hold of me. I think, again, half of New Mexico has my phone number by now, but just feel free to give me a call or shoot me a text and I am yours. So thank you, everybody.